So let's start with Homo sapiens before the cognitive revolution. This is the stage of human development which is known in spiral dynamics as the beige stage. It's the period of approximately until 60,000 years ago. So this is the time of Homo sapiens. So it's not yet Homo sapiens sapiens. Homo sapiens was a human ancestor that was aware of his and her actions, but there was not yet an awareness of the own awareness. So there was only limited consciousness, we would say. Now these people were living in a very instinctive manner. There was no statehood, no ideology, no religion, no arts, no culture or anything like that. So basically we can say that this stage is referring to our animal nature still. Now, how do we know something about the sex life of these ancestors? Well, first of all, we don't have any written records of this time. So how do we know something? Well, luckily, we can look at other primates. We can look at the bonobo or the chimpanzee because until about 4 or 5 million years ago, we had common ancestors. So it's very likely that a lot of these commonalities still stayed on in these early stages of human development. Now, for people that are very interested in learning more about the sex life of these bonobos or chimpanzees, I can really recommend you to read some of the books of Frans de Waal. He's one of the most famous primatologists. Now let's look at the first aspect here, marriage and sex. In our contemporary society, we see that sex should only take place within marriage. But how is this, let's say, 100,000 years ago? Because there was no marriage yet. Yet people were living together somehow. There was a structure to society. And most likely people were living together in groups of 20, 30, maybe 40 people or something like that. And they had this kind of informal agreements and arrangements. And it is very unlikely that everybody was having sex with everybody because that would have been too complex and too chaotic. Some scientists theorize that in those early ages, most people had 2 to 3 sex partners, or that this number of 2 or 3 was like the ideal number of sex partners. Why? Well, basically we have to go back to survival and the functions of sex. Why do we have sex? Basically, imagine you have one sexual partner and you're living in a very difficult and dangerous environment. If you only have one sexual partner, then you are limiting your chances for having offspring. The other thing is that something may happen to your partner, or your partner may suddenly be crippled and may not be able to bring food back home, and then also you and your offspring will have limited chances for survival. Of course, they're sharing within the group of 20 to 30 people, but there's still a little bit more access to these resources with the sexual partner. If you have 2 or 3 partners, then you are increasing the likelihood for having offspring. And you can actually increase the likelihood that you're going to have healthy offspring. And also in terms of your own survival and the survival of your offspring, if you have 2, maybe 3 partners you can rely on for your survival, for care, for bringing food, for providing shelter, for providing protection, you increase the chances of survival. Now, if you go to more than 3, let's say you have 6, 7 sexual partners, that's already too complex to manage because there's definitely going to be a lot of jealousy and dissatisfaction. But the other thing is also that you are going to rely on so many other people for your well-being, for food and protection, that maybe none of your partners is actually going to give it. And also the other way around, if you have so many partners, you also should basically extend that care and these resources to them, and you may not have enough resources to support everybody. So really we think that 2 or 3 sexual partners was something like the ideal. The other thing is that This was not a stable situation. It was not that suddenly somebody had 3 sexual partners and this would be until the end of his or her life. No, it was some kind of organically changing thing. So starting and breaking these bonds happened somehow organically, and this made the social fabric very changing. Now, there are some consequences when there is no marriage. If there is no marriage, there cannot be any premarital sex, so the concept of virginity did not exist. If there is no marriage, there is also no extramarital sex. And finally, if there is no marriage, there is no postmarital sex. So basically, there is no sex after the husband has died, because there is no husband. Now, although there was no premarital or extramarital sex, it doesn't mean that there were no emotions. Of course, there was probably a lot of drama. And it doesn't mean that all these sexual relationships were very smooth. There was probably still a lot of jealousy. Now, maybe let's look a little bit at jealousy. Like, what is jealousy? Are we jealous when the partner has sex with somebody else just because of the physiological release, because of the sexual act? No, it's not in the act. It has more to do with this function of sex again. It has to do with these resources, about the relational aspect of sex. Basically, when your partner has another sexual partner, then your access to resources basically declines. Your chances for survival decline. If you are counting on your partner to feed your 2 children, and suddenly your partner has to take care of 2 more children and another wife, then you will have some kind of competition. So basically, jealousy is caused by this fear of losing the exclusive access to these resources for survival. So, what about prostitution 100,000 years ago? There was no money, there were no jobs, there were no services, so logically there was no prostitution. But maybe there was something that we could call proto-prostitution, or some kind of precursor of prostitution. Basically, let's look again at the link between sex and care. People who have sex with each other take care of each other if they are healthy and normal. And basically, paying money for sex is something very similar, right? Because the money that is given is basically a proxy for care. Money is going to buy this protection and food and shelter. So basically, when somebody visits a commercial sex worker and provides money for the sexual act that is given, it's basically something very similar. It is just giving a certain amount of money that's going to give this care. So let me be very, very provocative. And I'll ask some questions. We don't need to answer them, and there's maybe not even a point in answering them, but let's just use these questions to stimulate some kind of thinking. When a woman 100,000 years ago was having sex in order to make sure that she and her offspring would have food and shelter and protection, did that make her a prostitute? She didn't get money, but she got care. What about a woman in our contemporary society who's completely fed up with her husband, but she's still staying with him because she's just afraid that she's not going to be able to survive? Does that make her a prostitute? Again, you don't need to answer these questions, and there's actually no point in answering the questions, but I just want to show the link between sex and care. So the next topic is sexual orientation and gender identity. Homosexuality does not have a reproductive function. You're not going to have offspring if 2 males fornicate or if 2 females fornicate. But homosexual intercourse can actually help in relieving tension and also in terms of bonding and seeking care. And if we're looking in the animal world, there's many species where you find homosexuality. It is not the norm, but it exists. So it's highly likely that there was also homosexuality in our earliest ancestors, but it was definitely not the norm. What about gender identity then? Well, identity is a social construct, and social constructs require a high level of cognitive skills, which were not there yet. So basically, there was no thinking about masculinity or femininity or about their own sexual orientation. Our ancestors didn't think about that. The next topic is sexual education. How did kids and youngsters learn about sex? I think there were three main ways, and they're a little bit interlinked with each other. The first thing is the full synchronization with nature. Basically, in order to have sex, you don't need to know anything. Healthy sexuality is when it just happens. And I think that our ancestors were probably much more in tune with this natural wisdom, with this inborn intelligence that's somehow programmed in our bodies. So it just happened somehow. The second way of sexual education was just by observation. When animals have sex, when they fornicate, they're not hiding in the bedroom or something like that. Quite often it just happens in front of everybody else. So it's quite likely that our earliest ancestors were also just seeing it, and they were just observing, and they were just trying to imitate. And the third thing was, of course, learning by doing. And I think here we also have an interesting phenomenon, because there was no virginity and there was no focus on monogamy. People had sex with several partners, and quite often a younger person would have sex with somebody who was many years older and would have much more sexual experience. So there was much more of a transfer of knowledge and know-how, you could say. So the next topic is sex and spirituality. Actually, there was no real spirituality in this early stage of human development, because spirituality requires a high level of consciousness and cognitive skills. However, we cannot say that there were no spiritual ideas at all, because some chimpanzee tribes are actually burying the dead, so there must be some kind of concept of spirituality, but it was probably not as evolved enough to be able to link sex and spirituality. So the final topic is sexual values and moral norms. Also here it's something similar. Values and norms require a very high level of cognitive skills, and also conceptual thinking is very important. And this was probably not there 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, so most likely there were no values. However, it doesn't mean that everything just happened and everybody was fine with it. No, there was probably a lot of drama. As I already said, there was lots of jealousy, there were probably lots of emotions, and most likely it's these very wild emotions that later became the basis for people to create values and norms.